Practical wisdom is an intellectual virtue that helps us reason through morally complex situations. So it's an intellectual virtue that assists with moral virtue, specifically by helping us figure out what the morally virtuous thing to do is when it's not obvious to our evaluations. The possible variation in the practical sphere is infinite, right? So there are an infinite number of possible ways that a situation might show up, a morally relevant situation. Um, this is trying to capture that you don't know who will be relevant, who will be present. You don't know where in the location they will be. All right, this is getting too abstract. Let's just imagine you know a little bit, like you're um, you're walking to work, and here's something you right. Well, we'll say it this way, right? You have to walk to work. You walk to work every day or every shift because you just so happen to work at the bakery down the block. Now, via our moral imagination, we can run scenarios, right? Um, we can run scenarios of the kinds of moral context we could encounter on our walk. We could see somebody, the classic idea of, an elderly person who could use a hand crossing the street, or a busy parent with the kids, you know, running wild around them that needs to just get their groceries in the house, and that you might leave early enough that you could help them get this stuff in the house, or um, a a car accident happens, and you're present and able to help because you have CPR training or whatever. Okay, so here's a couple of scenarios you can play with. The idea here is that we can run these scenarios in our mind ahead of time, and the possible variations of detail, many of which could be relevant to what we would do, are infinite. We can imagine people people's as small a difference as imagining talking to a person while they're at the trunk of the car versus on the other side of the car, and that could be the difference between someone being hit by a bicyclist running by or not. And um, Additionally, you can't imagine what sort of personality the various people in your scenario will have. How much will they be able to help themselves? How much will their attitudes make it hard for you to help them? Um, I don't know. I could go on and on. That's what's sort of being illustrated here, right? Let's remember that the practical sphere, or the sort of realm of moral virtue, um, is imprecise in Aristotle's estimation. This is an imprecise subject matter. To do moral philosophy requires that we also accept how little we can know in advance, and that makes it important to develop practical wisdom, which will be a skill, right? This is an intellectual virtue that will help us navigate these situations that arise, that we might imagine beforehand, but we cannot anticipate exactly what we will observe, exactly what we will be called to do. So because the possible variation is infinite, reason in the practical sphere is going to mean know how, or knowing what to do given what we encounter. So this isn't knowledge simply, right? This isn't knowledge that. This isn't knowledge of the facts. This is about, given the facts, now what, right? It's knowing what to do given what we have, given what we encounter. So, in other words, while he considers practical wisdom an intellectual virtue, uh, it it governs the moral virtues. It's sort of in charge of moral virtue for Aristotle. In chapter 6 of book 2, Aristotle says, quote, "Virtue is a characteristic involving choice, and it consists in observing the mean relative to us, a mean which is defined by a rational principle such as a man of practical wisdom would use to determine it." What the heck does that mean? Right? So the idea here is that um, The person who has practical wisdom, this is going to be the person who is able to determine um, what the virtuous thing is to do. And this person is going to be able to do it because Aristotle's idea here is that the doctrine of the mean is rationally understandable. Uh, it follows a logic. The problem is because of the nature of ethics, because the nature of ethics is imprecise, that logical knowledge or that theoretical knowledge doesn't tell us exactly what we get to do, you know, in real life. It just helps. But the people of practical wisdom have gotten very good at connecting what they know on this sort of level of theoretical knowledge, what they know according to reason, and what they're able to do with what they see. So think of the difference between someone who is generally kind, generous, inclusive, straightforward, or honest, right? A good old person, right? But this person doesn't articulate why they are so, or can't help you imagine how to act in different situations, or can't help you imagine how to develop those habits yourself. And then compare this person um, with someone who can and does express why they act the way they do and why they find this way of being or treating others sort of a good way to be. This is the difference between unreflective moral virtue and practical wisdom with moral virtue. Right? That first person is a great person. That's a person we're going to want that person around. We want lots of people to try to be like that person. The puzzle here that's being identified is that person um, hasn't acquired enough sort of self-knowledge and what I want to maybe call like critical discernment of context cues to be able to talk about why they are the way they are, or to be able to talk through why they do what they do in situations. And it is that the ability to do those things that is named by practical wisdom, the ability to express why you do what you do, why you evaluated this as in a situation that called for speaking up or called for charging in or called for whatever it was. And developing that keen sense of being able to translate what's sort of universally the case of moral virtue to what is particularly the case. That keen sense, that is practical wisdom, and it is extremely useful for us individually as well as for others. And that is very much the ideal that Aristotle has in mind when he talks about morally excellent people. These are people these are sort of not people with unreflective moral virtue, but people with moral virtue governed by practical wisdom.